So thank you, Dr. Schneider, for granting us this interview.
You're very welcome.
For the Hellenic Society of Existential Psychology.
Very welcome.
So we just figured out some questions, but we would like to know from your early experience as a student, what was that drove you to psychology in the first place?
Well, it started very early, actually. I mean, I think that I became interested in psychology with my early trauma, actually.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When my brother died at 7 years old and I was close to 3. And my world basically shattered at that point. The world of my parents, the family.
You were 3?
I was about 3, just under 3. And, you know, what was routine and familiar just days before was completely upended, completely changed. And there was just a huge tear in the fabric of my life that left me lost, and it led to a plunge into a lot of crying and tantruming, rage, extreme emotions back and forth, trying to deal with this huge loss in the family and how it affected my parents. So, in a way, it shattered my world, but it also opened up a whole new challenge and whole new possibilities. And to make a very long story short, my parents had the wisdom to send me to a psychotherapist, a psychoanalyst, child analyst. And I was about 5 at the time, a very young patient. And I don't remember a thing about what this person said. But what I do remember was his rock-solid presence. That he could be there with me in all my turmoil. And I had the sense that somehow he connected with it. Mm. That he had some very deep tragedies in his own life, and yet was able to not only survive but thrive through it. And it was a tremendous model for me as a little kid. And I think what it did was it helped me to move from a position of just abject terror and paralysis to one of slowly being intrigued by what I was opening into. Big questions about living, about my life, my brother's life. What's it about? Mm-hmm. What's going to happen to me? Of course, a lot of fears about illness or dying myself. But along with that was also, again, questions about who am I? What is this life about? How do I manage this life? What really matters about living? And I slowly got to the point where I was able to be with the upheaval of my feelings enough so I could be creative. I began to develop a quite creative inner life, complete with a movie set and actors. I would draw pictures of them and create movies, as I said, and stories. And I became more and more interested in science fiction also. And there were some great science fiction television shows at that time. So I was,
such as?
The Outer Limits, and I've written about this. Twilight Zone, One Step Beyond. These are all about, unusual states of mind, peculiar places, alien beings, the mysteries of life. how do we advance as a civilization? How do we actualize or grow as people, as individuals? So they were very rich television shows. And I'm sure I was working something through too. I could relate to these shows. And I was alone. I was an only child at that point. So I had a lot of time to really develop ideas. And I had some wonderful people around me. As I said, my parents, this analyst, eventually I thought more and more about going into psychology and writing. And my father was a humanistic educator. He was a school teacher, and then he became a doctor of education. And so I grew up with people like Rollo May and Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow around me. I mean, he had articles by them, books by them. I used some of their books to build cities as a kid. So there's a lot of rich, difficult but rich influences.
And as a student, you decided then to study psychology.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I would call this early trauma my introduction to existential psychology. But then my more formal introduction came when I became an undergraduate student. And I read Maurice Friedman's book, The Worlds of Existentialism, which was just a wonderful introduction, to the range of thinkers in the field. And I fell in love with existential psychology. I was reading Rollo May more, and Maslow, appreciating great stories and film. Hermann Hesse was a big influence. Of course, those are the days of Hesse, Steppenwolf and Damien. And Damien is so much similar, a coming-of-age story through difficult times, meeting a helpful witness, mentor. But going very deep, very deep. That was a big part of my pursuit. I was interested in the deeper questions. So I started in psychology, and I was very fortunate. I had a wonderful introductory psychology teacher. I don't know if I would have continued if I didn't, because I had.
Where did you study psychology? In
well,
California?
Initially, no, Ohio.
Ohio.
I'm from Cleveland, and initially I enrolled at Ohio University, which is not Ohio State, but it's not too far away. And I had a very good, as I say, psychology teacher there, who became a mentor and made these things relevant to our lives, raised great questions. But then I took some pretty lousy psychology courses too. And I can relate to what Rollo May said about his early experience with psychology. He learned a lot about rats and pigeons, but very little about human life.
You're talking about experimental psychology.
Yes,
Mainly.
much more of that kind of psychology, quantified, objectified.
And what made you then decide to become a psychotherapist? Because, okay, you had all these experiences, you had a good experience with your psychoanalyst, then you studied psychology, but then you decided to become a psychotherapist. How come?
I'm sure part of it was to understand my own upheaval and challenges. I had the privilege to meet not only my wonderful child analyst, but later when I was in graduate school at West Georgia College, which was a very humanistic-oriented graduate school on the East Coast, another wonderful analyst that I had. And she was both analytically oriented and existential, and just, again, so powerfully present. And it was so critical for me at that time in my life. I had another quite traumatic period. I call it a breakdown, actually, that I had. West Georgia. Again, a long story, but basically, I think it had a lot to do with my father was visiting, and he had been divorced and had a new wife, and I felt very far away from home, and this was a very radically new atmosphere for me. A lot of it was rich and wonderful, but it was also challenging for a kid from Cleveland. And I was scared. I was quite scared. And I had a very revered professor who invited and sort of challenged me to take up a practicum, an internship at a local psychiatric facility. And that scared the hell out of me at the time. And I think all of these things kind of precipitated a sort of regression back to some of these early terrors that I had. And I had a lot of issues at the time, challenging issues. And I then went to this woman, analyst, and she, basically what she helped me to do was to stay more deeply present to all of my feelings. And I practiced that and worked with that intensively in our sessions and outside of them. And it was very challenging because I had panic attacks and I had perceptual issues and a great deal of anxiety. But I think she helped me find, I won't say the key, but a key to fundamental healing.
And if I asked you, how? By being present, you said.
Mm-hmm. What do I mean by present?
Yes.
Being able to stay with, especially the feelings and body sensations of what I was experiencing. Not necessarily trying to figure things out so much.
Or explain.
Or explain, or even verbalize, but to feel, to sense, to imagine, to be with the flow of my experience, to come to a place where again I could move from panicky feelings, to gradual boldness, or maybe righteousness, anger, a capacity to take more risks, both with her and in my social arena.
I hear like you're saying that like she helped you transform your initial feelings and move.
Yes, to come into the more, as I put it now, the more of who I am.
The more of who you are.
Yes, yes. And I feel like this is a lot of what good psychotherapy does. It helps us move from a state of terror and fear to one of gradual intrigue, wonder, and venture. And through that process of going back and forth, and we often go back from terror to wonder, back to terror, back to wonder, but we are deepening our capacity through that to be in touch with the fuller range of our experience.
So I guess that if I asked you why then existential psychotherapy and why integrative existential psychotherapy?
Yes.
Why so?
Well, because for me existential therapy is the one that focuses on these bigger, fuller experiences of living and transformations. I feel that existential therapy, when it's done well, is a gateway to a development of a kind of paradoxical wholeness. now say sense of awe toward living, the capacity to experience our smallness, our fragility, our humility, the sense of being crushed, which we have to know as human beings if we're at all alive at times, but as well as our capacity to venture out, to become bolder, to entertain a wider range of thoughts and feelings, and to wonder about the world. And for me, that term awe captures those wonderful paradoxes of living, that give life its vitality. Here I think of Kazantzakis, because he's also a very important figure for me. I mean, from early on I learned about his Zorba, but then later Last Temptation of Christ and Report to Greco. I just very much admire that man's spirit and his embrace of the paradoxes of living.
You said before, when existential therapy is done well, what is it? What do you mean by well done? What are the attributes of a good existential psychotherapist? Or what would you say to new therapists? What is good existential therapy?
Good existential therapy begins with capacity to be as fully present as one can within one's own being. And I feel strongly that generally does not